Hey everybody, I'm Connor, this is Doug, and welcome to Poddy on Wayne, a podcast that celebrates everyone's favorite Aurora, Illinois-based cable access show. In this episode, we'll dig deep into the Wayne's World universe as we attempt to unpack the rather confusing lyrics to Bohemian Rhapsody. Who's Scaramouche? Why does he need to do the fandango? We'll also rank Saturday Night Live spin-off movies from the dreadful Night at the Roxbury all the way to the extraordinary Blues Brothers. When we're done there, we'll give you the inside scoop on who Dana Carvey based Garth on. Hint, it's his brother. Lame. Finally,
Connor, first off, party on, Connor.
Party on, Doug.
And even though I saw Wayne's World 2 4 times in the movie theater, this is not that podcast. This is the Bethel School District Presents, a podcast about the Bethel School District.
And just like you interrupt me every week, COVID interrupted a lot of things in our life, including state testing.
Nice transition.
Thank you. Brian Lawfer, our Director of Assessment and Highly Capable, recently reviewed the 2022 state testing results with the school board, and he said the 2018-19 school year was actually the last time the state did testing as we once knew it.
In 2019-20, state testing across the state and the nation was canceled by many states due to COVID. In spring 2021, that was when kids in Washington State were just coming back from remote into hybrid learning. So the state postponed the state testing that spring to do that same testing in the fall. So if a student was in third grade in the spring, they actually, in the fall of their fourth grade year, took that third grade test. And the state also did something like they wanted to get this done. So they made it a much, much smaller test for that time, less than 50% of what it originally was.
Brian said the spring of 2022 kind of represents the new normal for state testing.
It's back. We're testing, and it's our first real glimpse of, okay, post-pandemic, where are our kids at? It's also a new normal because they approved a shorter test design that will be used from now on. Not as small as that fall mini test, but not as big as what we had prior to COVID in 2018-19.
Now, there are too many numbers to read through them here, but you can find all this information on our website's data dashboard. The gist of it is we've seen a drop in both our ELA and math scores, while science stayed about the same. But Brian said it's important to get the context on this and not look at this in a vacuum.
The state has been through all the same changes as we have, so it's a good way to compare. So looking at our scores, comparing to the state, we can look at English language arts, third, fourth, fifth, or elementary grades. They're right within 1 to 2 points below the state, but they're right there at the same scores. In ELA, 6th, 7th, 8th, about 3 points below the state, pretty close to what the state was, but a little bit lower. And high school, actually, that gap was a little higher than we've seen in past years, about 7-point gap between the state and Bethel's percent meeting standard. For mathematics, a similar story in elementary, where right virtually on top of the state, the same scores, about 1 point difference between elementary grade levels, Bethel's percent meeting standard in the state. But over time, as 6th, 7th, 8th, and 10th grade, the gap between Bethel's percent meeting standard and the state widens. And that's an area of concern. And in science, we have about a 3-point gap, 6-point gap at 8th grade. But actually in high school, we just edged out the state by just some tenths of a point, but about the same.
During the meeting, School Board Vice President Director Brenda Rogers mentioned a separate national test that Bethel is part of called NAEP, the National Assessment of Education Progress, also called the Nation's Report Card, and is done using a random selection of students from every state, including some here in Bethel.
And it's the one thing that allows us to compare state to state to state because we all have different state tests, and even those that have the same test choose different cut marks of what's meeting standard. So it allows us to see that. We don't ever see results of our kids in that. It's only aggregated at the state level, partially because it's so small number of kids. It only becomes valid once they collect everybody in the state and they try to match the population of the state. So what came out there, just to give a little plug, is that the gap for reading that you saw in our state test, and especially the gap you're seeing in math, was replicated in NAEP.
So there are areas we need to work on, but they're the same areas school districts around the state and country are working on as well. Now you can look at all this on our website, and normally I'd give the shameless plug here, but Brian actually did that for us.
We actually have this publicly available for you and anybody in the public to see that. Simply go to our www.bethelsd.org. And you can then also click on About Our District and Data Dashboard. There's a few tiles of topics. The one that says state testing has a dashboard that you can drill in and see school results, disaggregate school results, and play with it yourself too. It's out there for all of us.
It's important to remember that school districts are more than just their state test scores. Connor, you actually recently spoke with Dr. Brian Lowney, our Assistant Superintendent of Secondary Schools, and you got to hear about what he's seeing as he visits schools and classrooms around the district.
I did. Dr. Brian Lowney is in his first year as our Assistant Superintendent for Secondary Schools. In that role, he oversees all of our middle and high schools, including the Pierce County Skills Center, as well as our alternative high school, Challenger, and the Bethel Acceleration Academy. Part of your job has you in schools observing principals, teachers, and staff. What have you seen this year that has impressed or surprised you?
Probably more impressed than surprised that just thinking about our secondary schools, they're small towns. Kind of remind me of aircraft carriers. Self-contained and taking care of everything from arrival. I was at Spanaway Middle School at about 6:30 the other morning last week and watching the carefully choreographed arrival of kiddos, all the adults out there with their lightsabers in the parking lot, getting kids and families safely into the building, greeting them with a smile, kids holding open doors. So you think about that careful attention to arrival is just the start of the day for kids. Throughout the day, the kind of supports that our staff are providing to kids to improve their learning. So whether it's small group instruction, whole classroom instruction, things down to making sure that kids have breakfast and lunch, kind of Maslow's hierarchy, making sure that those needs are met during the day so that kids can learn. And then I think about the after school piece of all of our secondary schools. And that's an important way for kids to stay connected to adults and to activities they care about. So was able to, over the last 3 weekends, go to each of our comprehensive high schools' homecoming games, even Bethel High Schools that because of the smoke was down in Ording. And just seeing obviously the kids on the field and the impact it has on them to be connected to schools, but our staff show up in droves to those kinds of events. And then really our parents in the community, those are community events. We don't have a formal township necessarily out here. So to go to a Friday night homecoming game and witness that with my own eyes this year for the first time here in Bethel, it was a real event and kind of encapsulates all the work that's happening in our secondary schools each day.
A lot of things you just mentioned there are things that parents would see every day. Is there anything that's going on behind the scenes that you want the community to know about?
There's a ton going on behind the scenes. We know that for every one thing you see in public, that there are about 10 things behind the scenes going on to make that happen. So at our secondary schools, whether it's a focus on social emotional learning, we know that coming out of the pandemic, even prior to the pandemic, middle school and high school age kids have a lot of things going on in their lives, whether it's family, whether it's work, whether it's school. And so that focus on social emotional learning is probably a bright spot coming out of the pandemic because we're shining a light even more directly onto that kind of learning. So whether it's through our panorama survey and getting data from kiddos on how they're feeling and whether they feel a sense of belonging and whether they think they can impact their own learning through their a sense of efficacy. That panorama's been big, whether it's piloting social emotional learning curriculum like Character Strong at our high schools, whether it's even the district adopting a partnership with Hazel Health so that our students have access to mental health supports and even physical health supports virtually. Those have been giant things behind the scenes that are going on. So that's one of the things that's been behind the scenes. Another is just our principals and teachers collaborating behind the scenes to not just form teams working for the betterment of student learning and students, but they're really committing to each other, to all children, that every student learns at high levels. So there's a ton of work going around in professional learning communities in schools. So that would be something parents wouldn't necessarily see, but I'm wondering, if they know that on last Friday during a professional learning day, that the whole staff at each of our school was together really focused on all children. I saw that firsthand at Cedar Crest Middle School and listened to some teachers and administrators talking about how to reach every kid, and it was really inspiring work. So those are the kinds of things that are going on behind the scenes.
Okay, so prior to your arrival at Bethel, you worked in the Puyallup School District in a similar role, and before that as a principal, and before that as a teacher. What's something that you learned early on in your career that still resonates with you today?
There's a ton of lessons I've learned, several of them the hard way, Connor. But one that I learned early on, for me anyway, is that positivity is contagious. And the principals I work most directly with hear me talk a lot about optimism. I want to work with a sense of optimism. And that doesn't mean that I'm positive Polly, that everything is, that I ignore the things that are really hard around us. It means that I want to acknowledge those things around us that are hard, and yet I think we can get through that and create positive outcomes for kids. So that sense of optimism and the fact that it's contagious and those around you can feed off of that, that's the kind of leader I want to be. And that I got that early on, whether that was through coaching or teaching or, like you said, being a principal. That's a big piece of my work.
And I was Googling some information about you prior to our interview, and I discovered there's actually a Brian Lowney who hosts a TV show called Fur, Fins, and Feathers. Now, strictly for journalistic purposes, I actually watched the show and determined that it's not you moonlighting as a TV host, but it does beg the question, do you have any pets?
We do. We have one golden retriever, Ginger, sweetest, kindest dog in the world. And now that my wife and I are empty nesters, my youngest moved to college, she gets a lot of attention in our household.
And we know you've heard the podcast, and you're well aware that we're nothing if not a fountain of dated movie references. So what's a movie or TV show that you find yourself quoting the most?
I am of an 80s kid, 70s and 80s kid, so I quote a ton of Seinfeld. I can't help it. If I say no soup for you one more time, I'll probably drive my family crazy. And the other one, interestingly, is I find myself quoting A Few Good Men. It's one of those movies I can't turn off when it comes on, whether it's a Jack Nicholson part, whether it's Tom Cruise part, or even more around my family, the Demi Moore parts. I know them all. I probably could do that movie from front to back with all of the quotes that are in it. So those are probably a couple that I quote most often.
Fantastic choices there. Love that Aaron Sorkin script and A Few Good Men. So I almost hate to bring this up. It's going to ostracize about 50% of our audience. I know that. But you're a big UW alum and a huge Huskies fan. So that's the big question. Do the Cougs have a shot at this year's Apple Cup?
It seems like the Cougs always have a shot. This year will be no different. Although Michael Penix Jr., the quarterback for the Huskies, seems to really be coming along. Dylan Morse really pushing on him, I know. One of our local kids, done good. So super excited about the Huskies' chances. But yes, unfortunately, the Cougs always have a shot in a rivalry game like the Apple Cup. So looking forward to that one.
Thanks for joining us, Brian. Appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks, Connor.
Well, Connor, you and Dr. Lowney ended up chatting about football, and that transitions us perfectly to our Seattle Seahawks ticket giveaway. We asked folks to simply email us with what they want to hear on upcoming episodes, and we got a lot of great suggestions. Everything from more jokes.
Specifically, kid-friendly jokes.
Speaking of which, did you know the Lego store just opened, Connor? Yeah, it was crazy. People were lined up for blocks.
Okay, you need to stop.
I'll try. From jokes to our community connections team to state testing data, which we actually just covered today.
Okay, here it is, people. We picked a winner at random. So drum roll, Doug.
Oh, that'll be a sound effect. We'll put that in later.
And the winner is from Elk Plains School of Choice, Carly McIver.
Congratulations and thank you to everybody who entered to win our Seattle Seahawks ticket giveaway.
And tune in next week to see what we're giving away then.
Could it be Taylor Swift tickets? Could it be more kid-friendly jokes?
We'll have to find out next week.
Until then, party on, Connor.
Party on, Doug.